Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, Sunday night, and Succession, episode 1, and it delivered. So here we go. Well, it's fresh, but I was taking my notes while I was watching. So let's start from the top. It's a really sad day when I'm rooting for Kendall and Shiv and Roman, but let's take that apart. The one thing I loved about this episode is all of the narcissism was on full display, but what was really on display, and it was almost like watching, once again, these genius writers, a beautifully constructed sort of narcissistic experiment. We really got to see what happens when Logan, the granddaddy, dark tetrad, no question about it, malignant narcissist, and then some. What happens when he actually loses his absolute core source of supply? I know that some people like to paint the picture as, oh, Logan loves his kids. That's what he loves his kids. I'm not buying that, since he's pulled the rug out from under them so many times. And it speaks to that push-pull even viewers have when they watch this show. And even the actors have, well, no, he loves his kids. He misses them. This isn't about missing them. Logan is now really unsupplied. The kind of banter and sparring and he had with his kids supplied him like nothing else. And to see that at his birthday party and all these people are around him, but it's not just sort of the existential dread of an older man going to a final conclusion that we're all headed to. With Logan, it was this that he did not have, again, his ultimate source of supply and his ultimate tool of regulation. He would really use his children as these pawns that he could. In fact, in one of the seasons, in season 3, in the last episode, his ex-wife, all of those kids' mothers, basically said that he really wanted to be able to, it's almost like he wouldn't get a pet. He wanted to kick something and see if it would come back or not, or only if it would come back was he interested. That's what he does with his kids. He'd kick them and they'd come back. He'd kick them and then they'd come back. And I really think, like most severely malignant narcissistic folks, I think they really believe that they've completely shaped someone to their complete and utter dominance. So what Kendall, Shiv, and Roman did was quite extraordinary, was pull them out of that subjugated system of Logan. And you can sort of see what he's like. He looks like he's basically on edge. He doesn't have his supply. He's as contemptuous and dismissive as ever, but I actually think there's an additional kind of an edge in him, but he doesn't want to give up the power. He doesn't want to be the one to call them. So that's what I'm saying, is it's not love, right? It's only about power. It's about holding that power. And that's a perfect example of what a Logan, that kind of narcissistic person, would look like. The scene with his bodyguard, Colin, I think it was, that was phenomenal from a narcissistic perspective. He says to his bodyguard, who you see him all the time, this guy, "You're my best friend." And this is sort of this kind of sad, especially in narcissistic people who have money and they go on in life and they have sort of these hired guns who sort of stay around. The bodyguard relationship is entirely transactional. That's it. There's nothing more there. The guy does his job and that's that. But that transactionality, it isn't lost on me that Logan called that person his best friend. It's actually the ultimate source of supply, and supply he can control forever with money. And then, sort of the icing on the cupcake here, Logan goes on to say how people are economic units. I'm 100 feet tall. These people are nothing. Together they form a market. What do we talk about with narcissism? That complete view of not only disposability but dehumanization, that other human beings are, in his case, only market to other narcissistic people, merely a convenience. And even the so-called best friend bodyguard is a person who's hired with only one role, which is to protect his life. Though Logan has an interesting victim-y moment, and this is something you see even in the most malignant narcissists when they lose their supply, he says, "Everything I try to do, people turn against me." That's that vulnerable underbelly coming up. You don't see those moments often with Logan. Here we see that victimhood. And Logan is also kind of hurtling towards existential dread. There was still probably the fantasy of the legacy, but he couldn't get out of his own way with wanting to play kind of the power play. I don't know if we'd say he misses them. I think he misses their supply. And that moment when he's with everyone and saying, does anyone have any jokes? Honestly, that was him missing Roman, because Roman was always that source of ridiculous, ribald, banal, I should say, comic relief. That was Roman. And in the absence of that, these people actually don't tango with him in the same way. They really exist, all those other people, Carl and Jerry, in his service. And that doesn't work for Logan. So he needs to go to battle. So that was an example of even saying, roast me, right? That was an example of Logan almost explicitly asking for baiting. But what I found very, very striking was at almost that last scene, with nothing to regulate, without sort of the chaos he creates with his children, constantly having to come back to him and begging for validation. You see Logan watching the evening news, which almost seems like something he doesn't do as much, but in the absence of the kids, that was something he was doing. And because he needs to use other people to regulate, he always has to have this complaining, contemptuous way of overpowering and subjugating people. He calls Sid, the news producer, or whoever directs his news station, and complains about what he was seeing. So that's all the Logan, exactly what we'd expect to see when a malignant narcissistic person, by their own doing, loses their supply that they thought would never go away. Interestingly, we're seeing some interesting stuff with Roman. Now, this entire kind of strange, and I'm sure temporary, alliance between Kendall, Roman, and Shiv, it's sort of interesting to watch. We've seen it in episodes in the past, but it's fascinating because for this moment in time, and it's only a moment in time, they're trying to pull out of that relational subjugation that's so much a part of the relationship with Logan, and playing with individuation. We're going to do this on our own, but Logan is still their frame of reference. So they're kind of only half individuating. But Roman remains the one who's sort of uniquely trauma bonded to the father. I think Kendall got to a different place, but Roman remains very trauma bonded to his dad and is very anxious. You can see his anxiety about the Pierce sort of takeover and all of that. But then when he finds his voice, there are these moments, as like, again, as much as they're three of the most horrible people in the world, I guess sort of the psychologist in me, seeing that they were narcissists who were narcissistically abused as kids, I was kind of in some sick, twisted way, kind of rooting for them, which sort of made me feel a little dirty, but I was still hoping for the best for them. But there, Roman is still he still throws off those insults, the cruel insults, which are obviously Roman's very much his defensive shield, right? By being contemptuous, Roman never needs to be vulnerable. And if Roman's vulnerable, the whole world will end up falling apart. Now, Shiv is, again, as always, still working her own angles, but we're seeing an interesting vulnerability in Shiv. Tom betrayed her. Now we're seeing some, times past, Tom has betrayed her. Clearly, they've gone their separate ways. But what's interesting is to see Shiv jealous. Shiv, again, similar to her father, somewhat malignant narcissist, that marriage worked for her because it was almost like a guaranteed, hugely power imbalanced relationship. And I think that's sort of why it worked for her, but it's also why she had contempt for Tom, just like all narcissistic people tend to have contempt for those in their midst who are less empowered. And the interesting thing is now that Tom's, basically Tom sort of showed her a side that he had never shown her before. There's, and I wouldn't say even a respect or an admiration, but she notices it. And there's a fair amount of jealousy. There was jealousy that he was out with the Naomi Pierce. There was jealousy that he might be dating models. That is a place where Shiv feels less empowered. For someone like her, that's never, ever going to work. That she's too narcissistic to be able to tolerate that. But I argue that all of these Roy children have massive issues around attachment and anxieties around separations. And so for Shiv, when they both kind of fall asleep on the bed like that, she wants the divorce from a place of power. And obviously he betrayed her, but there is that sort of separation issue. And if you look back in Shiv's history, she really holds on tight to how her mother did abandon her when she was around 10, 11 years old and sent her and her brothers to live with the father. So now we're also seeing this sort of Greg and his poor judgment. Remember, the jury's out for me on Greg. I don't know that he's narcissistic as much as that he's just sort of simple. And I thought I kind of was holding out for Greg to become Count Greg and sort of be the Count of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, but that didn't work out. But Greg is just sort of a bag of bad judgment. But what's interesting is I do see that Greg is somewhat trauma bonded to Tom. And so he is sort of his, Tom's shame boy. And Tom constantly places his shame on Greg. And then Greg seems to not have functioning frontal lobes. So he keeps doing this weird stuff and even telling Logan about the sex he had in the bedroom and bringing an inappropriate date. Tom continues to bully Greg, but this seems to be now a trauma bonded dance between the disgusting brothers. Greg is a dark horse, though. Something's going to happen there. We also now see this new emboldened and empowered Tom, which I find absolutely fascinating. I think that emboldened and empowered Tom is a funny creature, because this is what's so fascinating about narcissistic family systems. The whole toxic soup works when everyone is present. But with people pulled out, Marcia, his wife, is sort of off in Milan, as she said, as Carrie said, she's shopping forever. That's Logan's wife. The kids are out. In a weird way, even for Tom, this is an empty space. It's almost like sort of a hollow victory. But this emboldened Tom is an interesting person, yet he's going to slowly start to see that his only function for Logan is to be a bridge to Shiv. So that Tom having his own recognized personhood. Nobody has a recognized personhood with Logan, but least of all Tom. And so Tom really is being viewed as nothing more than a cell phone connection or a physical bridge to somebody else. There's absolutely, and I think that Tom thought that Logan is really, really going to have his back. Connor is an ass, and he is, still on his presidential pipe dream and his transactional fiance. Connor is as insipid and ridiculous as ever, obviously seeking validation so he doesn't lose his 1%. If that wasn't the most sad, sort of vulnerable meets communal narcissistic line I've ever heard, with sort of a grandiose cherry on top, I don't know what I've ever heard. And sort of he said, I want to get inserted into the news channel. So he wants to do all this wacky stuff at his wedding. This, the woman, obviously, who doesn't really love him, it's just sort of two transactional people in their dance. I've never been intrigued by Connor's storylines. I find him ridiculous and insipid, and this episode did nothing to correct that. But Logan has this emptiness. I think Logan's emptiness, to me, that was the narcissism theme of this, I was going to say this session, of this particular episode. And even how Logan still wants to reach in and says, have you heard from the rats? Indeed, if Logan was so surgically psychopathic that he could cut them off, he wouldn't care. He'd be like, I'm going ahead with this new company, I'm fine. But there's still this pull back to the supply that is his children. In his own way, as a narcissistic person, he has his own bizarre trauma bond with his trauma bonded children. And so again, and all he's got is Tom, who is at best, a one-dimensional kind of substitute for these children that were so much more gratifying for Logan to be able to control. So you see how triangulated this system is. It always was, so that's not a shift. Like all narcissistic systems, it's triangulated, but now more than ever. But they're definitely still stuck in the dance with dad. There's no way that Shiv, Kendall, and Roman are ever going to fully individuate. And I think what's happening now is that they're kidding themselves. Hey, look, we made the deal for $10 billion with Pierce. We're individuating, but actually not at all. They're simply trying to get one over on their father. And anyone out there who's ever tried to sort of clap back at a narcissistic parent by succeeding at exactly the thing that the narcissistic person told them they couldn't, that means you haven't subjugated. You're still dancing to the beat of the music set by the narcissistic parent. And this is no different. But he is, there is a moment where he's recognizing them, but he's recognizing them as rivals. We'll see where that goes, but they're definitely not that much closer to individuation, maybe like 2 steps. And I have to say, though, at the very end, when you see Shiv and Tom in that bed, and they do finally hold hands and recognize that they basically are 2 people who've destroyed each other, because that's all that anyone would do in a narcissistic marriage. It might have been the only honest moment in their relationship and their marriage, and the only one that will ever be. So let me tell you, Succession, perfect, all the themes there. But like I said, the main theme tonight is watching what happens when Logan loses his critical supply other people can't stand in. Carl and Jerry and Tom and Greg, those people will never, ever be able to stand in for those kids. It's not that the kids are loved. It's not that his kids mean something to him, but they were the ultimate subjugated supply. He had them completely and he made them. So he felt entitled to them. And how dare these people he felt entitled to have not only stepped away, but tried to sort of beat him out in a deal he was making. So I'm at the edge of my seat for next week. So I can't wait. And I can't wait. Pull the sweatpants back on and watch it with you. So hope you enjoyed that narcissistic analysis of the most narcissistic show on the air. Thanks again.